There was a time when the 737 wasn't controversial. It actually is the most produced aircraft in history at over 11,513 aircraft delivered, soon to be the second most produced aircraft though, as Airbus has caught up to them and will soon overtake them, mostly due to the immense public scrutiny and the two air disasters that have absolutely tanked its reputation. So what happened to this hero?
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
So how did the 737 live long enough to become a villain? In this video, we're going to be discussing the 737, its history, and how the safest 737 became its most hated variant. To be fair to the 737 and its legacy, as we are discussing it, we're going to break it up by era. It will allow us to see how improvements in design can impact a very similar airframe in metrics such as safety, technology, and range. There are 4 distinct 737 lines or generations that went through design changes that would warrant a distinction. They are first, the first gen, or the original, the classic, next generation, and the MAX. The story of the 737 begins in the early 60s, a time when aviation was really on the come up. Boeing, recognizing the demand for short to medium range jetliners, set out to create an aircraft that would redefine air travel as we know it. The 737-100 and 200 models took flight first in the late 60s. These early iterations laid the foundation for what would become the most successful commercial aircraft in history. Here we'll refer to this variant as the original line. Boeing's design philosophy for the 737 has always centered on versatility and reliability. The aircraft's twin-engine configuration, combined with the narrow body design, struck a balance that catered to the diverse needs of airlines around the globe. The engine nacelles are directly mounted to the underside of the wings without pylons, allowing the landing gear to be shortened, thus lowering the fuselage to improve baggage and passenger access. With the next generation and MAX generation, we would discover that this seemingly good design intent would actually become a huge problem for the platform. We often talk about how Boeing never used to cut corners or care about money and that they just totally lost their way with the MAX, but that's not really the full story. Boeing, even in the 60s, was desperate to become the market leader, and although they had some huge successes with the 727 and the 707, they wanted to rush out a competitor to the many existing short-haul aircraft on the market. They accomplished this by leaning heavily on the 727 design, using 60% of the structure and systems that were already on the 727. Only differing really in length from the 727, which itself was already an iteration of the 707 aircraft. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with streamlining the engineering process and using existing proven technology. That's just good engineering practice in general. The problem only really arises when you stretch that original design intent far beyond its capabilities to the point where you need maneuvering characteristics augmentation systems to have the aircraft fly similarly to previously released variants to avoid pilots needing to be recertified to fly in the MAX just to make a better marketable plane based off a nearly 70-year-old design.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
But that's a story I've already discussed at length. For most of its history, the 737 has been the most produced commercial jet on the market, very much following in the footsteps of its predecessors. Even despite the problems with the latest iteration and the ensuing PR nightmare for Boeing, the over 11,000 units delivered and counting stands as evidence that the 737 remains a top choice for airlines looking for a reliable workhorse. As I mentioned earlier, the 737 has 4 distinct generations, but for the purpose of this ranking system, I've combined the first 2 generations together due to their similarities. As I go through each generation, they will be treated as 3 separate aircraft on my ultimate ranking list. But before we dive into the ranking, I just want to explain a little bit of the philosophy behind the ultimate aircraft ranking system. It's a system that I've developed that's meant to standardize the key metrics and categories of aircraft in a way that lets us compare aircraft of any type of any era. It's meant to score these aircraft in the most objective way possible. It's done by scoring the aircraft based on 5 weighted categories: cost, speed, versatility, innovation, and effectiveness. Each category has metrics assigned to them that lets us compare aircraft with similar roles from its era. After comparing these metrics against other aircraft of the same type from the same era, it's given a score of 1 through 10, 10 being the highest based off of these metrics. But if you want to know more about the details of the scoring system, I made a full video explaining the methodology behind it. Feel free to check that out. So first up, we have the 737 original/classic generation. The inflation adjusted cost per unit for the original generation of the 737 was only $33.7 million, or in other words, $260,000 per seat. Very well priced. This price per seat was really only beaten by the DC-8, which was no longer in production at the time. Now for the classic variant, it costs just a bit more inflation adjusted at $35.6 million, but it comes in at even less on a per passenger basis at $212,000 in a single class configuration. That's an absolute steal for the classic, and it's easily the most affordable aircraft on a per passenger basis. It gets a 10 for cost. As for speed, the 737 Original and Classic cruised at a speed of 0.745 Mach. It's better than its main competitor, but it's fairly middle of the road for its era. And for a commercial aircraft, we're really only going to be looking at cruise speed, as the aircraft are rarely going to be pushed above this because airlines want to make money, and the best money they can make is usually traveling around at cruise speed. It gets a 6 for speed. As for versatility, the 737 has 22 commercial variants and 6 other non-commercial variants, including military, private, and cargo variants. The original generation had a military aircraft called the T-43 as a variant, as a multi-engine trainer for the military. The range of the original was about 3,000 miles, which is less than the DC-9 and below average. And as for the Classic, the range actually slightly decreased to 2,733 to make room for a little more passenger space at 168 passengers compared to the original max capacity of 138 passengers. It gets a 4 for versatility due to its shorter range, but the fact that it set the stage for so many variants and a really successful family. As far as innovation goes, the 737 was the first aircraft to be certified with an instrument approach. But it only took one generation to start to run into problems with the low ground clearance. With the new high bypass turbofan engines on the 737 Classic, they actually had to reduce the size of the bypass fan and move the whole engine forward. The 737 Classic was also one of the first aircraft to feature an electronic flight instrument system, and as for efficiency, it comes in at about 68 miles per gallon per seat, which was the best fuel efficiency of its era, excluding the 757. So overall, it gets a 6 for innovation. Since arguably the most important part of a commercial aircraft is taking people from point A to B as safely as possible, I consider safety one of the most important factors in ranking effectiveness of commercial aircraft. To truly determine how safe an aircraft was, I've researched and compiled all the incidences of hull losses, or total loss of aircraft, and fatalities of every commercial aircraft since the advent of commercial flight. I use this data to create a hull loss factor and fatality factor score for each aircraft. To better understand what the hull loss factor and fatality factor score mean, let's use the 707 as an example. The 707 makes up about 1.98% of every commercial aircraft ever built. Using that number, I then calculated the percentage of total loss accidents, or hull loss accidents, of every total loss accidents of every commercial aircraft. I then took that crash percentage and divided it by the percentage of commercial aircraft built to get a standardized factor of hull losses. In this case, the hull loss factor is 5.11. Put even more simply, the hull loss factor means it crashed about 5.11 times more than it should have based on the percentage of aircraft that the 707 makes up of every aircraft ever built, which means it definitely was not the safest plane on the market. If the hull loss factor is a 1, it means that it had just as many accidents as you would expect it to have based off of its production run. It was perfectly average. Put even more simply, a big number for a hull loss factor or a fatality factor is bad, and a small number is good. We want to see a small number. Closer to 0, the better. Having said all that, the 737 Original had a whole loss factor of 3.25. In other words, it crashed and you lost the entire aircraft 3.25 times more than its production run should have crashed. The fatality factor was 2.93, or 2.93 times what it should have been to be average. This was actually a little bit of a backslide for Boeing on the safety factor, but a little understandable also given the era and the fact that it was a brand new family of aircraft. It was about the same rate as other aircraft for safety at the time. It was really only outdone by the 727 before it for a whole loss factor. However, we also see a big increase in safety in the next generation of the Classic, where the Classic had a whole loss factor of 1.23 and the fatality factor of 0.71. It was actually the second Boeing aircraft to achieve a fatality factor of less than 1. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. The 737 original had a production run of about 17 years, which is not out of the ordinary for commercial aircraft lines at the time. It had a total of 1,144 aircraft produced, making up 2.2% of every commercial aircraft ever produced. Obviously an incredible success for the production run, and so much so that it has endured an additional 57 years since its first flights. As for the Classic, was also a pretty good production run of 16 years. It had a total units produced of 1,988, more than any preceding aircraft family or generation before it. That means the Classic makes up 3.85% of every commercial aircraft ever produced. Overall, the 737 Classic/Original get an 8 for effectiveness, very respectable score. And the 737 Original/Classic generations get a 6.10 for overall score. The story continues with the 737 Next Generation. With an inflation-adjusted cost of $112.6 million, a pretty big jump up, and that gives it a per passenger cost of $524,000. A significant step up, obviously, but it was pretty average on a per passenger basis for the aircraft size of its era. It was really only undercut by the A320 at its time, so it gets a score of 5 for cost. For speed, it has a slight uptick in speed from the previous generation of 737, coming in at Mach 0.785, gets a 5 for speed. As for versatility, the 737 had the most number of variants, having over 250 Boeing business jets and converted freighters. There was also the C-40 military transport, the E-7 Wedgetail, and the P-8, which we actually covered on a previous video, which, by the way, did not get as many views as I would have thought. It's a great video if you want to check it out. It's a video all about submarine hunters. The range of the 737 Next Generation also increased, coming in at 3,464 miles, and the max passenger count also increased, coming up to 215 passengers in a single class configuration. Overall, the 737 Next Generation has better range and more floor space and more variants, so it gets a 7 for versatility. As for innovation, the 737 Next Generation added wider wingspan, new engines. It was also the first single-aisle jetliner family to be concurrently designed fully with CAD, which has so many qualifiers, I don't really put much stock into that claim, but whatever. Also, I know it's definitely not the first CAD-designed aircraft, or even commercial aircraft, so whatever that means. It also had improved avionics, and as for efficiency, it has 88 miles per gallon per seat, which is pretty good, and short haul, a 99 miles per gallon per seats. Overall, that means it had the best fuel efficiency around at the time, excluding the 757, until the A220 overtook it 7 years later. Overall, a pretty good innovation, getting a score of 7. As for effectiveness, the 737 Next Generation has been the best-selling 737 generation, coming in at 6,972 aircraft produced to date. It has an active production run coming in at 27 years plus. It is a huge percentage of every commercial aircraft ever manufactured, at 13.51% of every major commercial aircraft ever produced, and a big jump in safety as well, coming in at a whole loss factor of 0.12 and a fatality factor of 0.13. It is by far the most effective 737 line. All of this combined with the fact that it is the second most produced generation of aircraft, second only to the A320 classic engine option for the number of units produced for any aircraft generation ever, it gets a 9 for effectiveness. That gives the 737 next generation an overall score of 7.15. Last and certainly least, we have the 737 MAX. First flying in 2016, this was Boeing's corner-cutting response to the immensely popular A320. It was a Hail Mary attempt to stay on top as the most prominent commercial aircraft manufacturer in the world, and unfortunately the cost would come with the deadly accidents that we all heard about, peeling the veil back on a company that was far too focused on profits, and that somewhere along the way Boeing had lost its way. But I won't belabor the point as much, as it's like kicking at a dead horse at this point. Even I have dedicated an entire video about it in the past. If you'd like to watch that to understand the full problem with the 737 MAX, feel free. So let's dive into the analysis of the MAX. First, we have cost. Coming in as the most expensive 737 generation at $138 million inflation adjusted, that gives it a per passenger cost of around $600,000 in a single aisle configuration, a big jump in price compared to its predecessors, and much more expensive than its main rival, the A320 Neo, coming in at $450,000 per passenger. Still, it's not the most expensive aircraft on the market, so it gets a 3 for cost. As for speed, it's the same as the next generation at Mach 0.785 gets a 5 for speed. For versatility, it doesn't have variants like the next generation does, likely due to the fact that it has a limited run at this point. However, it has a big jump in range at 4,430 miles, and a small uptick in max passenger count of 230. Overall, it gets a 5 for versatility. The most prominent innovation features on this 737 generation are its increased fuel efficiency, the range, size, and the new engines, along with its pretty cool split-tip winglets. Fuel efficiency for the 737 MAX on regional routes is 103.2 miles per gallon per seat, slightly edged out by the A320. For short haul routes, it's 121 miles per gallon per seat, tied with the A320 Neo for best. And for medium haul routes, it's 110 miles per gallon per passenger, which is the best with the exception of the A220. So overall gets a 7 for innovation. For effectiveness, it's been a pretty successful run with 1,402 units produced and 1,400 in service. It's been in production for over 8 years, and it already makes up 2.7% of every commercial aircraft ever. The whole loss factor is 0.05, believe it or not. That makes it the safest 737 generation by a fair margin. So if this is the safest 737, you might be asking yourself, why has there been so much emphasis in the media about how the 737 MAX is so dangerous and how people will swear off this aircraft and will never fly it? Why is it that this is actually the safest? Well, the reason that this is an issue of safety and it's been discussed so prominently in the media is not because it's statistically the safest aircraft, but it's because aircraft have become so incredibly reliable and so incredibly safe in recent history. It's the contrast between this 737 MAX crashing twice and every other brand new airplane almost never crashing. It's almost unheard of. The fatality factor for the 737 MAX is actually 0.3, which is incredibly low from a historical perspective, but has become an unacceptably high fatality rate. In this day and age, with the amount of safety we have built into aircraft, it really is abysmal. The last time a major Western commercial aircraft had a fatality factor over 1 was the MD-11, and that started flying 34 years ago. But even back then with the MD-11, it was well known in the industry that the MD-11 had a very poor safety record. Having said all that, 0.3 in this day and age, when all the contemporary competitors to the MAX have literally 0 fatalities, the newest Western aircraft that has had any fatality was the ERG family, which is 22 years old. but it still has 1/10 of the fatality factor that the Max has at 0.03. Despite the Max's commercial success, its safety record leaves it with a score of 4 for effectiveness, giving the Max an overall score of 5.25. So having said all this, let's now look at how every single 737 generation stack up against each other. First, in last place, we have the 737 MAX, to exactly no one's surprise. Next up, we have the original / classic generations coming in second place. And the best performing generation of the 737 by the Ultimate Aircraft Ranking System is the next generation 737. In the next video, if you enjoyed this one, we're going to be talking about the retired aircraft. If the 737 MAX is good enough to continue manufacturing, what does that say about the other aircraft that Boeing had stopped manufacturing? In the next video, we're going to be discussing all the aircraft that Boeing has stopped producing and retired. So if you're interested in seeing that video next, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching the video up to this point, and Godspeed.